Until 1640, wealthy London merchants, problem with my thumbs, deposited their surplus gold and silver at the government mint in the Tower of London. In that year, Charles I seized it, and the Tower was no longer a safe place for people to leave their deposits. So they looked around for an alternative, and they came up with the goldsmiths of Lombard Street. And they chose the goldsmiths because they already had strong boxes for their own valuables. And the goldsmiths paid 5% interest on those deposits, on the understanding, of course, that they could lend the money until it was required by the depositors, and gave the depositors receipts for it, which became known as goldsmiths' notes. And wealthy Londoners soon found that it was easier to use notes in their transactions than to go and get the gold and silver from the goldsmiths. If you'd go and buy a fur coat for your wife or something or other, you'd have to go and get a whole bag of gold coins, and it was a lot easier just to give the furrier some notes from the goldsmiths, which he would be happy to take. And that's the way the system began to work. Well, the goldsmiths were bright people, and it didn't take them long to figure out that they could lend more money than they had in their vaults, which they did. And the reason they could get away with that is because the depositors didn't all come in to collect their gold and silver coins at once. Only a few would come in. And consequently, the amount of loans outstanding at any one time could vastly exceed the actual cash that was on deposit. And that began the system of fractional reserve banking, fractional reserve system. It was to become the most profitable scam in the history of the world. Gary, were you able to find me a glass of water or something?
It's not glass, it's paper.
Oh, it's here, right beside me, huh? That's too bad. We're both a little dense and a little dumb, a little blind.
But you're good looking.
Thank you. The scam was legalized when the Bank of England was chartered. In 1964, the King, William, was short of money and to finance his troops and the armaments for war. And so someone said, well, why don't you start a bank? So the wealthy people of London contributed £1,200,000 in gold and silver coins and formed a Bank of England, lent all of the money to the king, the government, at 8% interest, which was a pretty high rate of interest for government secured bonds, in my opinion. And then, of course, there were some little charges in addition, in exactly the same way that banks do today. Well, in order to show his appreciation, William said, well, you now can print £1,200,000 in banknotes and lend them to your wealthy customers and friends at high interest rates. So in effect, he said you can lend the same money twice, once to the government and once to your wealthy friends. Well, over the years, that ratio has become much more generous. Due to the avarice of the banks and the collusion or cooperation of politicians, the ratios have just continued to climb over the years. In the early years of the 20th century, US federally chartered banks were required to have a gold reserve of 25%. That means that the banks were allowed to lend the same money 4 times. When I was young in Canada, banks had to have an 8% cash reserve, which meant they could lend the same money 12.5 times. Today, in most jurisdictions, the ratio is 20 to 1. And in some of the banks that had problems in Wall Street not too long ago, they had their ratios up to 30 to 1 or a little bit higher. Today, the cash reserve requirements in the United States are 3% on checking loans, 0 on deposits, savings deposits, and 0 on Eurodollar accounts. In Canada, the reserve requirement is 0, period. You are lucky if your bank has a cent or a cent and a half in cash or legal tender for every dollar that you think you have in the bank. The requirement for cash reserves was eliminated by the Mulroney government in amendments to the Bank Act in 1991. They were phased out over, I think it was a 3-year period, if I remember correctly. This resulted in the gift to the private banks of several $billion a year. Taxpayers are paying interest on billions of dollars of government bonds and treasury bills that the banks used to buy them with the cash they no longer have to keep in reserve against their deposits. So you may ask, why should we have to pay billions of dollars in interest on bonds and T-bills to private banks who created the money out of thin air? Before proceeding, let me just give you a brief review of how privately owned banks actually create money.